Hey guys, tonight we're setting off on an unusual kind of journey. Not through kingdoms and battlefields, but back into a forgotten age. Deep into the frozen breath of the Ice Age, where one of our closest relatives once roamed the wilderness with a presence that defied extinction. Meet the Neanderthals, those thick-boned, sharp-eyed, frost-hardened kin of ours who weren't just surviving in the cold. They were thriving, pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be human long before we arrived to judge them with clubs and cartoons. Before we ease into the calm of sleep, let's unravel who they really were, not just as ancient beings, but as a people with culture, adaptation, and strength that would humble most modern athletes. Now dim the lights, let the hum of the fan settle like distant wind over tundra, and picture this. It's 80,000 years ago, and you've wandered into glacial Europe, a realm so harsh it would freeze you to the bone before you could finish shivering. Yet in that unforgiving place, if you were lucky or perhaps unlucky enough, you might spot one of the dominant hominins of the land. Not some groaning brute with a stick, but a broad-shouldered, thick-limbed figure that looked like it could grapple a mammoth just for exercise. That was Neanderthal territory. And they didn't just endure the Ice Age, they embodied it. They were not miniature versions of us, and certainly not broken drafts of what would later become modern humanity. They were purpose-built survival machines. Imagine if Arctic survivalists, powerlifters, and toolmakers had collaborated to forge a being sculpted from cold, stone, and sinew. That's what evolution gave us in the form of Neanderthals. Their height might have been modest, averaging around 5.5 feet, but size in this case was deceptive. Their bodies were dense, almost compacted like coiled steel springs. Their ribcage ballooned outward to house powerful lungs, while their arms and legs were all muscle and function, built for action, not aesthetics. Their frames spoke of endurance, not elegance. Thick femurs that could anchor an ox, shoulder girdles wide enough to carry the weight of survival, and joints that seemed better suited to dragging game through snow than typing emails. And let's not forget their hands. Oh, those hands! Massive and skilled, able to craft stone tools with precision or wrest open whatever primitive container fate had placed between them and food. Their thumbs were thick and opposable, giving them an iron grip and a distinct edge in manipulating the world around them. It's almost comical to imagine them in modern life, unscrewing jar lids we'd consider impossible or deadlifting logs as a warm-up. Their faces were not grotesque mutations, they were expressions of adaptation. The Neanderthal visage wasn't malformed, it was engineered. Their skulls sat low and long, as if streamlined against icy winds, topped with prominent brow ridges like built-in visors. Their noses, enormous, not for vanity but ventilation. Those cavernous nasal passages helped warm the freezing air before it hit the lungs, turning every breath into a minor miracle of survival. They lacked prominent chins, something we now see as a symbol of humanity. But in their world, jutting chins were a luxury evolution had no use for. Their features weren't ugly. They were functional. And perhaps more importantly, they worked. To think of them as cavemen is to do them a profound disservice. They were not prototypes of us. They were not mistakes. They were parallel champions in the arena of evolution, with bodies designed to take punishment, brains built for more than just instinct, and lives defined by ingenuity as much as by force. While we might walk away from a scraped knee with a complaint, the Neanderthals wore their fractures like medals. Their bones tell of bruises and breaks, of wounds healed and endured. Each skeleton a diary of resilience etched in calcium. And their legs, what marvels they were. Shorter than ours but packed with the kind of dense strength needed to trek through uneven, icy terrain. These weren't marathoners, no. They were mountaineers with reindeer on their backs. Their knees bent easily and often, fitting for a people who spent much of their time crouched beside a fire, crafting tools, or carving into the frozen flesh of their prey. Their arms, too, tell a story of raw force. The upper bones were thick, thicker than ours by a startling degree, and the forearms even more so, giving them a mechanical advantage when wielding tools or hauling the heavy remains of a successful hunt. In them you could read a life of hard labor but also of purpose. They weren't straining for sport. They were shaping the world with every motion. And when you turn to the torso, the story continues. Their ribcage didn't taper elegantly like ours do. No, they flared wide and high, giving room for massive lungs. When you're living in an environment where oxygen is scarce and frost coats your eyelashes, you don't just want deep breaths, you need them. A Neanderthal's breath was the fuel of survival, drawn in like the bellows of a forge, and used to push through the coldest storms. Even their skulls told tales of strength. Heavy, flat, and reinforced, they offered space for powerful jaw muscles. These were beings who could chew raw meat, gnaw frozen sinew, and still crack a joke, if only we could understand the language it was in. The cost of all this might have been a shorter lifespan and quicker maturity, but in the harshness of Ice Age life, every year mattered and they made each one count. Their injuries were frequent, their recovery constant, and their lives full of motion, tension, and endurance. You don't find a skeleton like that in a species that lounges. They weren't accidents, they were specialists, born into a frozen world and built to thrive in it. If there was one thing the Neanderthals possessed in great supply, beyond muscle and bone, it was brain power. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally. Inside those heavy skulls was a brain often larger than our own, not by a small margin either. Their cranial capacity could reach up to 1,500 cubic centimeters, sometimes more, compared to the modern human average of around 1,300 to 1,400. And while brain size isn't the sole determinant of intelligence, it's far from meaningless, especially when you're living in a world where misjudging your surroundings could get you trampled by a woolly rhinoceros. But what did they use those brains for? Not taxes, not stock portfolios, and certainly not doom scrolling through a stone tablet equivalent of social media. No, the Neanderthal brain was tuned for survival in the purest sense. Much of it was devoted to interpreting the world through sight and movement. Their visual cortex was robust, likely giving them superior eyesight, which would have been essential in a landscape of dim winters, stalking shadows, and terrain as unpredictable as it was hostile. They didn't just see well, they moved with precision, navigating ice-covered ravines, tracking elusive prey across blanketed tundra, avoiding deadly predators while carrying slabs of meat on their backs. All of that required coordination and sharp instincts. They didn't get second chances. In their world, a moment of clumsiness could be fatal. And yet, they weren't just reactive animals operating on brute impulse. Their lives required planning, collaboration, even a level of aesthetic awareness. These were hominins who worked with tools that took time and thought to create. They learned to adapt to different terrains across Europe and Asia, from dense forests to wind-blasted plains. That required more than strength. It demanded mental flexibility, memory, and problem-solving. They weren't copying us either. For a long time, modern scientists assumed Neanderthals merely mimicked early Homo sapiens, adopting tools, ornaments, and perhaps even rituals through proximity or theft. But discoveries have turned that narrative upside down. Artifacts attributed exclusively to Neanderthals, tools, pigments, even decorative pieces, date back to periods before modern humans arrived in the same regions. In other words, the Neanderthals weren't crashing our party. They threw their own long before we got there. Take the pigments they used: red ochre, crushed minerals, applied to tools, bodies, perhaps even skin. Was it symbolic, spiritual, artistic? We don't fully know, but what we do know is this: it was intentional. Somewhere sometime, a Neanderthal looked at a red rock and decided it should be ground into powder and smeared on something. That impulse, that need to create, decorate, signal meaning, is profoundly human, or rather profoundly Neanderthal. Their tools weren't haphazard stones banged together in frustration. They followed a complex methodology, one of which modern researchers call the Levallois technique, a calculated process of preparing a stone core in order to remove flakes of a specific size and shape. This required visualization, foresight, and dexterity. They weren't improvising, they were planning. And their fire, oh, their fire. It wasn't a lucky lightning strike, it wasn't borrowed flame. Archaeological evidence shows they knew how to strike flint against pyrite, generating sparks to ignite moss or dry grass. They built hearths, maintained coals, and returned to the same fire pits over years, maybe generations. Their fires weren't just warmth and light. They were the center of home, security, and transformation. They roasted meat, boiled bones, perhaps even shared stories by the glow. Fire wasn't just survival, it was culture. It turned raw food into nourishment, raw places into shelter, raw moments into memory. It made winter tolerable and night less terrifying. In a world where nature played no favorites and offered no mercy, the Neanderthals carved out space for ingenuity, resilience, and, astonishingly, a touch of style. In caves across Europe, we've found evidence of decoration: eagle talons shaped into necklaces, shells pierced for threading, and beads perhaps worn or exchanged. These weren't utilitarian tools. They were expressions. And clothing. Far from the loincloth cliches, Neanderthal wardrobes were likely complex. They processed animal hides, softened them, and stitched them using bone needles. Stitching, a technology so deceptively advanced it requires thread, tools, planning, and patience. Their garments weren't just protection against the cold. They were crafted, assembled, and perhaps even personalized. There's even the faintest whisper of grooming. Did they comb their hair, smear ochre for beauty, wear feathers for flair? We can't be certain, but there's enough evidence to suggest that in the middle of a snow-covered hellscape, Neanderthals paused long enough to express themselves. So what do we make of this? Were they wild things with clubs? Or were they something more, beings with breath, thought, rhythm, and ritual? They didn't leave behind written records, no scrolls or carved legends, but they left behind bones, tools, pigments, and shelters. They left echoes in the genes of modern humans, whispers in our immune systems and our skin. They left behind a story not of defeat, but of brilliance under pressure, of thriving in places we'd barely survive. They were a mirror, faint and ancient, but one that reflects possibilities of what being human could have meant, long before we claimed that title as ours alone. If strength had a blueprint, it would look a lot like the Neanderthal body. Not just strength in the flashy, bicep-flexing sense, but a deep, functional resilience, a kind of primal power that pulsed through every joint and sinew. These weren't beings who lifted for vanity. They lifted because their lives demanded it. Daily existence required the kind of physical labor that would grind modern muscles into dust. When we talk about Neanderthal strength, we're not dabbling in exaggeration. The estimates, based on biomechanics and bone density, suggest that an average male Neanderthal could easily surpass the strength of a modern human by 50%, possibly more. That includes grip strength so formidable that their fingers could close around a modern human's hand like a blacksmith's vise. The kind of grip that didn't need gym chalk or wrist wraps. Their muscles were not just bigger, they were optimized. Thick shoulders, powerful thighs, and dense forearms were their natural state, not the result of training. Where we might need years of discipline to build a physique worthy of admiration, Neanderthals were born halfway there. And they needed every bit of it. Their hunting strategies were not remote or refined. They didn't sit from a distance and pick off prey with long-range weapons. Instead, they got close, uncomfortably close. Their tools were thrusting spears, not javelins. To use them effectively meant stepping right up to a mammoth's flank, a reindeer's ribs, or a wild boar's tusks. The fights were brutal, personal, and deadly. A single misstep could result in a shattered limb or a collapsed chest. And yet they did this again and again, season after season, wound after wound. Their fossil record tells the tale clearly. You don't have to guess at the violence. You can see it etched into the bone, fractured ribs, crushed skulls, shattered arms, and damage that would have left most of us begging for morphine and rest. But they didn't have time for weakness. They healed. Sometimes poorly, sometimes completely. But they endured. There's one skeleton, known to researchers as Shanidar 1, that tells a story few would believe if it weren't physically in front of us. This individual had suffered a massive blow to the head, likely blinding one eye and crushing part of the skull. The right arm had withered, possibly from a break that never healed properly. The foot was injured too. And yet this person lived for years after those injuries. That kind of survival implies more than strength. It implies compassion. Someone cared for Shanidar 1, fed him, protected him, helped him move through the world despite his broken body. Because while Neanderthals were rugged, they weren't heartless. The survival of the severely injured among them tells us something quietly profound. They looked after their own. It wasn't just Shanidar. Other remains show similar patterns. Elderly individuals with arthritis and spinal issues, toothless elders who clearly couldn't have eaten without help. If these people had been abandoned, they would have died quickly, but they didn't. They were supported, not out of weakness, but out of a strength that went beyond the body, a social strength, a bond, a kind of prehistoric loyalty that defies our assumptions. And then there was the fashion. Not the Hollywood kind, not runway ready, but fashion nonetheless, created for survival, shaped by skill and sprinkled with unexpected flair. Ice Age Europe wasn't the kind of place that welcomed exposed skin. If you walked into winter wearing only ambition and fur over one shoulder, you'd freeze solid before lunch. Neanderthals knew this, so they adapted. They didn't just drape hides around themselves. They softened skins, stitched them, tailored them for movement, warmth, and durability. Bone needles found at Neanderthal sites show the care and precision involved. This wasn't haphazard wrapping, it was functional design, a kind of Paleolithic outerwear assembled with intention. And their accessories, not entirely practical. We've uncovered claw necklaces, pierced shells, decorative beads. Items that didn't serve a clear utility, but held meaning nonetheless. Maybe they marked status, maybe they honored hunts, maybe they were gifts or tokens of love or luck. But whatever the reason, the urge to adorn oneself with the world's materials, to express something personal, was alive and well. Imagine a Neanderthal walking into camp, eagle talon necklace swaying, shell bead clinking, eyes narrowed beneath a snow-dusted brow. This wasn't some mindless brute. This was a being with pride, identity, and a sense of presence. The cold might have shaped their bodies, but their minds reached out for something more. Even their use of ochre, red mineral pigment, was more than utilitarian. Smeared on objects, perhaps even on skin or fur, it suggests ritual, symbolism, or aesthetic expression. Was it camouflage, ceremony, a form of early makeup? We don't know. But we do know that a Neanderthal once picked up a red stone and decided it should become something else. That kind of behavior hints at a consciousness that moves beyond need, into want, into art. So when you think of Neanderthals, don't imagine them as lumbering shadows grunting by firelight. See them instead as survivors who carried the weight of ice and time on their shoulders, who dressed with care, healed with patience, and faced every day with a blend of might and mystery. They didn't just walk the frozen earth, they owned it. To live in the Ice Age was to live in defiance of nature. and no one defied it more completely than the Neanderthals. These were not mere wanderers scraping by on berries and luck. They were builders of fire, shapers of stone, hunters of giants. Their world was not gentle. It howled, it froze, it fractured. But still they rose each day with lungs full of frost and muscles honed by survival. Let's talk about fire. Not the accidental spark of a lucky lightning strike, but the deliberate, practiced skill of conjuring warmth from flint and willpower. Fire to the Neanderthals wasn't an afterthought. It was a centerpiece. Archaeological evidence reveals carefully arranged hearths, fire pits, that weren't simply places to cook meat, but sites of community. Rings of ash and burnt bone that built up over years, maybe generations. These weren't momentary camps. They were homes. We found heated stones and blackened wood, sometimes buried in layers of repeated use. That tells us they returned to the same places, rebuilt the same fires, and passed on the knowledge of how to coax flame from rock. The prevailing theory is that they struck flint against pyrite, a method that creates sparks hot enough to ignite dry grass or moss. No lighters, no matches, no help. Just sharp edges, patience, and a desperate need for warmth. And they didn't just use fire to stave off the cold. They used it to transform. Cooking meat made it easier to chew and digest, reduced parasites, and unlocked nutrients hidden in raw flesh. It was, in many ways, an evolutionary leap. By softening food with fire, they may have given themselves time to rest, to craft, to think. Fire turned the unrelenting bite of raw meat into sustenance. It turned night into something bearable. It allowed them to push farther into lands that would have otherwise driven them back. They may have even used fire as a kind of tool-making aid, heating certain stones before knapping them, chipping them into sharp tools, can make the rock more pliable, easier to shape. It's possible Neanderthals discovered this through experimentation, or maybe by accident. But once learned, it would have been passed on, practiced, refined. They didn't just make use of fire, they partnered with it. And the predators? Fire was a warning. Flames lit the caves and cast long, shifting shadows on stone walls. They kept the night beasts at bay. Bears, hyenas, saber-toothed cats that would have gladly picked off an isolated human. But around the fire there was a perimeter of safety. Not absolute, but meaningful. Fire created space, space to tell stories, to laugh, to heal. Their tools also tell a story, one of meticulous craft and evolving genius. They didn't just bash rocks together, hoping something useful would emerge. They prepared cores of stone with anticipation, knowing that the right strike would peel off flakes in the shape they needed. This was the Levallois technique, a method that required planning several steps ahead. They weren't improvising. They were executing a sequence. They made scrapers to process hides, points to penetrate flesh, borers to pierce bone or wood, and even hafted tools, blades mounted onto shafts with resin and sinew. Think about that for a moment. They created adhesive from tree sap. They tied it all together with tendons from animals they had hunted. This wasn't simply survival. This was prehistoric engineering. And their toolkits weren't uniform. Different Neanderthal groups used different materials. Some favored limestone, others flint. Some explored the use of antler and bone. These variations speak not just to resourcefulness, but to culture, to innovation. They weren't robots following instinct. They were communities experimenting with their environments. Even their mistakes, their trial and error, can still be seen in broken flakes and discarded cores. It paints a picture of minds at work, of learning passed through generations, of a lineage that didn't settle for good enough, but instead sought refinement. And through all this, the fire, the tools, the icy hunts, they remained deeply social. Not just cooperative, but connected in a way that feels startlingly familiar. They buried their dead. That single fact, unearthed from ancient soil, shifts the way we see them. Burial suggests more than survival. It suggests memory, meaning grief. At sites across Europe, we find skeletons placed intentionally in pits, sometimes accompanied by pollen, remnants of flowers. Did they believe in an afterlife? Or were they simply honoring the departed? We don't know, but the act itself speaks volumes. They didn't just dispose of their dead, they laid them to rest. And that act, whatever the motive, echoes across time as something unmistakably human. Then there's the art. For decades, Neanderthals were written out of the artistic narrative. We believed only modern humans made cave paintings or crafted ornaments. But that belief was wrong. Red ochre handprints and abstract designs have been found in caves in Spain, dated to over 64,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens ever arrived. They weren't copying us. We were latecomers to their gallery. They also collected objects with no practical use: eagle claws, decorated bones, beads. Maybe they were talismans. Maybe they were symbols of identity or status. Maybe they were gifts. But in each item is the seed of intention, of expression, of ritual. And deep underground in France, they built strange, circular structures out of stalagmites. No sunlight reached those places. There was no obvious purpose, no function. And yet they built. In the dark, in silence, they moved and placed and shaped. What were they doing? We can only guess. But the effort alone is haunting. They also spoke, or at least had the anatomy to. Their throats, their hyoid bones, their genes suggest the capacity for speech. Maybe not as complex as ours, maybe not as poetic. But words of some kind were likely exchanged in the flicker of firelight, warnings, jokes, names, memories. They didn't live in silence. They weren't grunts and gestures. They were voices carried on cold air, voices that said more than danger and food. They spoke of life and death, of loyalty, of belonging. And that is where we leave them, for now, not as shadows in a cave, but as people who burned with fire, spoke with purpose, and touched the world with more than just survival. One of the more surprising revelations about Neanderthals, something that once made scientists shuffle papers and clear throats uncomfortably, is that they didn't just pass in and out of our world as distant cousins. They became part of us. Literally. When early modern humans migrated into Europe and Asia tens of thousands of years ago, they didn't treat the Neanderthals as a curiosity or a threat to be avoided. No, they did what humans tend to do. They mingled, merged, and in some cases fell into each other's arms, or at least into each other's DNA. The evidence isn't subtle. It's woven into our genes. Today, most people of non-African descent carry traces of Neanderthal DNA, between 1 and 4%, depending on ancestry. It's not an obscure quirk. It's a biological footprint, a record of contact that was more than just territorial overlap. It was intimate, repeated, and spread across centuries and continents. What were those first encounters like? We'll never know. Were they alliances? Accidents, exchanges of resources and knowledge, possibly all of those and more. Human history has always been messy. Some unions were likely consensual, perhaps even built on companionship or mutual protection. Others may not have been. The past doesn't offer us a tidy record. It only leaves traces, some of them beautiful, some of them shadowed. But the result was enduring. Neanderthal genes shaped the humans who came after. They influenced traits we still carry today: how we respond to allergens, how our immune systems fend off disease, how our skin reacts to sun and cold. Some gene variants even affect things as subtle and strange as sleep cycles, pain sensitivity, or how we process fat. That midnight craving for meat, that bizarre aversion to cilantro. Perhaps, just perhaps, your Ice Age ancestors had a say in it. Of course, not all inherited traits are beneficial. Some Neanderthal-linked genes are associated with increased risk for type 2 diabetes, depression, or nicotine addiction. They were not perfect blueprints. They were survivors, not saints. The fusion of our lineages was not a recipe for improvement, it was a mixing of survival strategies. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it complicated things. And this mingling didn't happen just once. Genetic data shows that interbreeding occurred multiple times in different regions across long periods. This wasn't a fleeting encounter. It was a series of interwoven moments, flickers of contact and cohabitation that left a permanent mark. There was no grand unification, no hybrid superspecies, just a quiet, enduring intertwining. Interestingly, the genetic evidence points to a greater mixing from Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females. Whether this was due to chance, dominance, opportunity, or mutual choice is unclear. But the result is that our family tree is more like a thicket, tangled, complex, and full of unexpected branches. This, perhaps more than anything else, should change how we think about Neanderthals. They are not some other. They are not a separate species to be studied like exotic animals. They are part of us. In our blood, in our bones, in the deep encoding of who we are, their legacy continues. So the next time you find yourself sunburned too easily, grumpy in winter, or mysteriously drawn to the woods, remember, it might be the Neanderthal in you. Not gone, not forgotten, just sleeping quietly beneath the surface, whispering through your genes. And as for those who carry little or no Neanderthal DNA, primarily people of African descent, it doesn't mean their lineage lacks ancient depth. Far from it. Their ancestors remained in Africa and encountered different archaic humans, like the enigmatic Denisovans, adding a different set of strands to the great human tapestry. In truth, we're all hybrids, all echoes of deeper origins than we often realize. The story of human evolution was never a clean relay race. It was a dance, a chaotic, beautiful, sometimes tragic, sometimes tender dance across millennia. And the Neanderthals, they were one of our earliest partners. Their story didn't end in isolation. It ended in absorption, not erased but woven in, not vanished but transformed. For over 300,000 years, Neanderthals stood as titans of survival. Through ice and famine, across continents and epochs, they endured. But then quietly, without fanfare or final battle, they began to disappear. Not in one moment, not in a sudden collapse, but gradually, like the last embers of a great fire fading into ash. By around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. Not extinct in the way of comets or catastrophes. Gone in a way that felt more like a soft fade into the background of history. So what happened? Why did this formidable species, so expertly adapted to its world, vanish? One explanation points to the climate. The Ice Age wasn't a single unbroken chill, it fluctuated, pulsing between frigid stasis and sudden, sharp warming. As glaciers receded and landscapes shifted, the ecosystems the Neanderthals had dominated began to transform. Forests replaced tundra. Large, cold-loving game became harder to find. The very terrain they were built for was changing beneath their feet. They weren't equipped to adapt quickly to new environments, not because they lacked intelligence, but because their evolutionary success had been so precisely tuned to the old world. Another possibility is us, modern Homo sapiens. When our ancestors entered Europe and Asia, they brought with them not only new tools and tactics, but something harder to measure: momentum. They spread quickly, adapted swiftly, and organized in larger, more interconnected groups. Their technology was more varied, their art more complex, their communication possibly more nuanced, and they reproduced at a faster rate. It wasn't an outright war. There are no signs of mass violence or conquest in the archaeological record. Instead, it was something subtler: competition, resource pressure, perhaps cultural assimilation. The two species coexisted for thousands of years. They shared territories, traded genes, and possibly ideas. But over time, the Neanderthals became fewer, isolated, fragmented. Their population had always been small, tens of thousands at most across vast distances. That made them vulnerable. A bad winter, a failed hunt, a disease with no immunity, any of these could decimate a small band. And with fewer individuals came fewer births, fewer connections, fewer chances for innovation or rescue. It wasn't a dramatic extinction, it was attrition, a slow wearing away. The final Neanderthals, it seems, found refuge in the southern edges of Europe, places like Gibraltar, where the climate remained more stable. There, in hidden caves along the coast, they held on for perhaps 1,000 years longer than elsewhere. But eventually, even those pockets fell silent. And yet, even in their ending, they weren't erased. Their genes live on in us. Their tools survive in stone. Their fire pits remain buried in layers of ash and memory. We carry pieces of them not only in our bodies, but in our instincts, our resilience, our hunger for expression and survival. It's easy to think of extinction as failure. But what if the Neanderthals didn't fail? What if they simply merged with the future? What if their greatest legacy wasn't dominance but endurance through us? They left no cathedrals or chronicles, but they left warmth in a hearth, pigment on stone, and hands that once healed the injured. And in doing so, they left something else, something quiet but enduring, a trace, a presence. They didn't go out with a roar, they went out with a whisper. For most of modern history, the image of the Neanderthal has been a caricature, less a portrait, more a warning. A slouched brute with tangled hair, dragging a club and grunting through a half-formed thought. That image wasn't born from evidence, but from ego. When the first Neanderthal bones were unearthed in the mid-19th century, they baffled the scientists of the time. The skull resembled a human's, but with differences that seemed, at least to Victorian minds, monstrous. Thick brow ridges, broad limbs, and a posture misread as ape-like. Those early scholars didn't interpret the Neanderthal as a cousin. They cast it as a cautionary tale. Primitive, failed, a detour on the way to us. It didn't help that the name Neanderthal sounded harsh to European ears. It was easy to imagine a beast lurking in caves, snarling under low stone ceilings. Early reconstructions leaned into this grotesque fantasy. One particularly infamous drawing showed a Neanderthal bent like a gorilla, neckless and dull-eyed, an artistic blunder based on the skeleton of an elderly man who had suffered from arthritis. From that one misreading, the myth took hold. Textbooks followed, films followed, cartoons followed, and in each retelling the Neanderthal became less real and more ridiculous, a symbol of everything we thought we'd transcended. The crude, the mute, the obsolete. What this myth accomplished was twofold. First, it made us feel superior. If the Neanderthal was a beast, then we modern humans were the pinnacle, the chosen ones, the only true inheritors of Earth. Second, it gave us an excuse to ignore the parts of them that looked too much like us. The buried dead, the carved tools, the painted walls, the moments of grace. For over a century, this version of the Neanderthal reigned, but the bones refused to stay silent. As archaeology advanced and new discoveries emerged, the cracks in the old narrative grew wider. Scientists began to realize that the so-called primitive Neanderthals had brains as large as ours, often larger, that they created tools with precision and consistency, that they made art, buried their kin, cared for their wounded. And slowly, the caricature began to collapse. Today, we understand that Neanderthals weren't evolutionary embarrassments. They were a different kind of success. Not worse, not less, just different. A branch of humanity that adapted to one of the harshest climates the planet had to offer, and did so with a blend of muscle, memory, and mind. Their disappearance wasn't the result of inferiority. It was the product of change, climate, population, competition, and time. And even in their absence, they shaped what came next. The truth is, Neanderthals challenge our need for a tidy narrative. We want a clean story, from ape to man, from darkness to light. But evolution doesn't write that way. It experiments, iterates, doubles back, blends. The Neanderthal wasn't a failed draft. They were a co-author of our shared history. We like to believe that we are special, that our intelligence, our creativity, our endurance make us unique. But the more we learn about Neanderthals, the more we see how close we really were. They laughed, they bled, they feared, they hoped, perhaps not in the same words, but in the same ways. And maybe that's why we tried so hard to diminish them, because seeing ourselves in them makes our reflection more complicated. But history, when told honestly, isn't about perfection. It's about presence. And the Neanderthals were undeniably here. They lived full lives in a world we can barely imagine. And though they're gone, they are not forgotten. There's something haunting about the Neanderthal legacy, not just in their bones or their genes, but in their absence. For all their resilience, for all their adaptation, their story ends without a monument, without a final word. They left behind no scrolls, no myths etched in stone, no names spoken across centuries. And yet they remain, etched into our identity like the ghosts of a forgotten song. We see this most vividly in their traces across our world today. Statues stand in their memory. Museums catalog their tools. DNA sequencing projects hum in labs where their genomes are parsed like sacred texts. But beyond the science, they've taken root in something deeper, our imagination. The figure of the Neanderthal has moved from scientific obscurity into cultural folklore. They've become more than ancient hominins. They've become symbols. In classrooms, schoolchildren now learn that these early humans weren't grunting savages but survivors. In popular media, they're no longer jokes but protagonists, given back the dignity that was once denied them. And in the fields of anthropology, the Neanderthal has become a lens through which we examine ourselves, who we are, who we could have been, who we still might be. Because in every Neanderthal reconstruction, in every face sculpted from bone and clay, there's a flicker of something unsettlingly familiar, not just in the brow or the jawline, but in the eyes. Eyes that look back. Eyes that challenge the clean lines we draw between then and now. And in that look is a question. What does it mean to be human? The Neanderthal doesn't offer an easy answer. They blur the boundaries. They remind us that humanity didn't begin with writing or cities or agriculture. It began with firelight in a cave, with hands shaping tools, with minds that wondered and remembered and mourned. They remind us that strength isn't just the ability to lift, but the will to carry others when they fall. That intelligence isn't measured in technology alone, but in persistence, adaptation, and the ability to see not just the world but one's place in it. They remind us that culture can exist without books, that art can emerge in the darkest places, and that kindness, yes, even in an ice age, was not a modern invention. And they remind us, perhaps most painfully, that even the strongest can fade. That survival isn't guaranteed even for the best prepared. That sometimes to endure you must be more than adapted, you must be lucky. Still, in their disappearance they did not vanish. They live in our blood, in the tilt of a nose, in the way we process sunlight, in the shadows of our dreams. They are not just a chapter in our story, they are a part of our sentence. So when the snow falls quietly in the forest, or when the stars burn clear and cold overhead, remember them. Not as relics, not as beasts, but as people who once stood on this earth, who lit fires in the dark, and who, for a time, were everything we ever hoped to be. It's one thing to survive a world of predators and ice. It's another to survive memory, to resist the erosion of time. And somehow, Neanderthals have done both. Not through monuments or scrolls, but through fragments, tiny, resilient echoes scattered across our history, our bodies, our culture. Modern science has pulled these echoes into focus. In labs filled with machines more complex than anything imagined even a century ago, geneticists and anthropologists have cracked open the double helix and found ancient fingerprints. Through painstaking sequencing of ancient bone fragments, we now know that the Neanderthal story is not locked in the past. It's written across millions of living people. If your ancestry traces back beyond Africa, there's a good chance that a small portion of your DNA, a percent here, a percent there, originates from a Neanderthal ancestor. And that small piece is not meaningless. It's expressed in surprising ways. For example, some Neanderthal gene variants influence how you respond to sunlight. Others shape your immune system's defenses against pathogens. Some are tied to your sensitivity to pain, your tendency toward allergies, or even how easily your skin burns. In other words, parts of their evolutionary toolkit are still functioning in our daily lives. But the inheritance is complex. Not every genetic legacy is a gift. Some Neanderthal-derived variants have been linked to disorders, things like type 2 diabetes, mood instability, or nicotine addiction. It's not a clean ledger. Evolution never writes in straight lines. Still, the depth of this connection is profound. Neanderthals didn't just brush up against our ancestors in a passing migration. They merged with them. Over time, in multiple places, the two populations intertwined, not just genetically, but perhaps culturally. Shared tools, shared shelters, shared knowledge, maybe even shared songs if they had such things. And this legacy raises a provocative thought. Perhaps we didn't simply outlive them. Perhaps we absorbed them. In that sense, the Neanderthals didn't end. They changed form. They folded into the future, not erased, but diffused into the rising tide of Homo sapiens, until their distinct features blurred but never quite disappeared. And it's not just the Neanderthals. Other archaic humans like the Denisovans, another mysterious branch, also contributed to our genome. Some modern populations, especially in parts of Oceania and Asia, carry genetic traces from these elusive ancestors too, which means the human story is not one of a single lineage marching forward, but a web, a tangle, a conversation between different kinds of humans who met, mingled, and moved on. The family tree is no longer a straight trunk. It's a thicket of branches, crossed and twisted, each bearing fruit that shapes the present. And yet, the Neanderthals remain the most visible symbol of this truth. The face we once mocked now stares back at us from the mirror with quiet defiance. That slightly broader nose, that fondness for winter nights, that ache in your joints when it snows, maybe it's not just you. Maybe it's them, still here, still felt, still part of what it means to be human. They were the first to call Europe home. Long before stone circles dotted the British Isles or cathedrals pierced the sky, the Neanderthals walked the frozen valleys, climbed the ridges, and stared into the same stars we do. For nearly 300,000 years they endured what few could have survived. Endless winters, colossal beasts, unforgiving landscapes. They were in every sense the locals, the ancient ones. And then they were gone. It wasn't sudden. No comet lit the sky. No war swept through their strongholds. There were no last stands, no burning cities, no cries for help. Just silence. A silence that settled across the land like falling snow. No new tools. No more hearths. No more graves. Just a stillness that slowly spread until even their shelters lay abandoned. Their final holdouts were likely in the southern reaches of Europe, in sunlit coves and limestone caves near what we now call Gibraltar. These places offered warmth, shelter, and perhaps a few more years of survival. But even there, their numbers dwindled. The archaeological record fades, not with violence but with absence. This fading has puzzled generations of scholars. How could such a durable, resourceful species simply vanish? The answers are layered. Part of it was the shifting climate. As the Earth warmed, ecosystems changed. The animals Neanderthals depended on became rare. Forests crept into places once dominated by cold steppes. Their prey patterns altered. Their hunting strategies, so effective in one environment, became less useful in another. And then there was us, modern humans. Our ancestors arrived with new tools, new behaviors, and critically, greater numbers. They adapted more quickly, formed larger social groups, invented lighter, faster weapons. Their survival strategies were not just different, they were increasingly dominant. Yet there's no sign of a great conflict. The evidence doesn't point to slaughter or genocide. Instead, what we find is overlap, layers of habitation where Neanderthals and Homo sapiens likely lived near or with one another. The two species exchanged more than blows. They exchanged genes, ideas, perhaps even songs around the fire. And over time, the smaller, more isolated Neanderthal groups became fewer still. In a world that required adaptability, they had been too finely tuned to a past that was rapidly slipping away. But calling that a failure misses the point. They thrived longer than we have, by far. They survived dozens of millennia through some of the harshest climates Earth has ever seen. They weren't erased. They were absorbed. They didn't vanish. They changed form. And some part of them, small though it may be, walks with us still. When you walk through a forest in winter, when you press your back to a cave wall or stare at firelight flickering against stone, you are brushing up against something they once knew. You are echoing their lives in subtle ways. And whether you carry their DNA or not, you carry their story. Not in myths, not in ruins, but in the very way you endure. For decades after their discovery, Neanderthals remained trapped in a cage of misunderstanding, a cage we built for them. They were studied, sketched, reconstructed, and ridiculed. Not because the evidence demanded it, but because we did. Because in the story we told ourselves about human evolution, there could only be one victor, one chosen branch. And the Neanderthals, powerful and ancient though they were, had to be cast as the loser. When scientists in the 19th century unearthed those first skeletal remains in a German valley, what would later give them the name Neanderthal, they didn't see a fellow human. They saw something that made them uncomfortable. Something close, but not quite. Something that suggested we weren't as unique as we'd like to believe. And so, the narrative hardened. They were labeled brutish, hunched, inferior, a failure of evolution. It didn't matter that the skull belonged to an old man with arthritis. The damage was done. Illustrators depicted Neanderthals as hulking beasts with blank expressions and dragging knuckles. Schoolbooks followed suit. The story became canon, and in the eyes of the world they became cavemen in the worst possible sense of the word. It was a story that made us feel special. If they were beasts, then we were angels. If they were stuck in the past, we were the future. The myth made room for pride. It justified supremacy. It allowed us to look in the mirror and see perfection, instead of a patchwork of borrowed traits and shared origins. But the truth, as always, refused to stay buried. Every new fossil, every archaeological find, chipped away at the myth. We discovered Neanderthal burials, carefully arranged, sometimes with flowers or grave goods. We found pigments and carvings, signs of art and expression. We uncovered tools that rivaled our own, fire pits that suggested long-term habitation, shelters built with thought and planning. And slowly, the story began to shift. No longer were they seen as evolutionary rejects. They were revealed as something more complex, more worthy. They were humans, not Homo sapiens, but human in a broader, richer sense. A sibling branch, a parallel success. It turned out we had judged them not by their deeds, but by our own insecurity. Because what the Neanderthals truly represent is possibility. The possibility that intelligence is not exclusive. That there are many ways to live, many ways to be. That culture, care, and creativity are not the sole property of our species. They challenge the myth of linear progress. They remind us that history is messy, nonlinear, and full of branching paths. And perhaps most importantly, they show us what happens when we refuse to see the full humanity in others. For over a century, we denied the Neanderthals their voice. We silenced them with our arrogance. But now, as the evidence mounts, we're finally beginning to listen. They were not beasts in the dark. They were people. They were mothers and hunters, artists and caregivers, storytellers and survivors. They were more like us than we ever dared admit. And maybe, just maybe, if we had lived alongside them a little longer, we would have learned a thing or two. To know that a people once lived and then vanished is one thing, but to realize that they shaped us and that we've shaped how they're remembered is something far more intimate. In many ways, the Neanderthals never truly disappeared. They transformed not only in our DNA, but in the stories we tell, the art we create, and the questions we ask about our own identity. Their modern resurrection has come not through fire or science alone, but through narrative. Across Japan, Europe, the Americas, artists and writers have begun to revisit them, not as grunting caricatures, but as living, thinking beings with stories to tell. Documentaries explore their ingenuity. Museums now reconstruct them with care, using forensics and empathy to breathe life into what was once called extinct. They now appear not only in textbooks but in video games, television dramas, and even speculative fiction. And in all these places, their depiction is changing, no longer monsters but mysteries. The silence they left behind has become fertile ground for imagination. If they buried their dead, did they mourn? If they painted with ochre, did they dream? If they sat around the fire, what did they say? The truth is, we don't fully know, and that is what makes them powerful. By vanishing, the Neanderthals gave us a rare kind of gift, a story with just enough pieces to see ourselves in it, but not so many that we can ever be certain. That ambiguity, that haunting absence, allows every generation to reimagine them anew. And perhaps that's why they linger, because they were never meant to be a fixed image. They were meant to be a mirror, not just to show us where we came from, but to reflect what we choose to see. In the age of mythology, the gods taught lessons through their flaws. In the age of reason, our ancestors became myths themselves. The Neanderthals, resilient, tender, brutal, brilliant, have become such a myth, a reminder of what was and what might have been. In the quiet of caves, in the ash of ancient hearths, their legacy waits, not in thunderous proclamations, but in echoes. In paintings on stone that outlast the hands that made them. In broken tools that still fit neatly into ours. In the chill of winter that awakens some long-buried instinct to gather, to guard, to survive. They were not us, and yet they were not apart. They were a version of humanity forged in cold and silence, shaped by endurance and grit. And though the world changed, though the ice receded and the stars shifted in the sky, something of them remained, not just in genetics, but in the quiet way we remember the fire. Even now, the Neanderthal story refuses to settle. Every few years, another discovery jolts us awake. A cave painting dated older than expected, a genome revealing deeper interbreeding, a tool that challenges our assumptions. It's as if they're still speaking, not with words but with remnants, bone, pigment, ash, and silence. And in that silence, we keep hearing something new. In Japan, schoolgirls whisper their names in history class. In Germany, statues mark the valley where their bones were first unearthed. In Nagano, martial artists train with naginata blades and invoke legends that carry echoes of ancient warriors. And at global conventions, where fantasy, science, and pop culture collide, cosplayers portray ancient humans not as beasts but as ancestors, symbols, spirits of resistance. Neanderthals have moved beyond archaeology. They have entered the realm of archetype. Once feared for their difference, now they are celebrated for it. Once erased from the narrative, now they're central to it. And that evolution of memory, of perception, is as important as the biology. Because the truth is, we've never needed the Neanderthal to be monstrous. We've needed them to be real. Tangible evidence that humanity is not a singular story but a tapestry, messy, tangled, glorious. They remind us that intelligence wears many faces, that strength takes many forms, that survival is not always conquest. Sometimes it's compassion, sometimes it's adaptation, sometimes it's retreat. Perhaps most profoundly, the Neanderthal teaches us that legacy isn't measured in monuments or empires. It's measured in presence, in the way a story lingers after the storyteller is gone, in the way a fire, long extinguished, still leaves the stones warm. We may never know the last words spoken by a Neanderthal. We may never know if they named the stars, if they believed in gods, if they sang. But we know they mattered, because we are still asking, still searching, still listening. In the end, maybe their greatest triumph is not that they endured for so long, but that they're still here, not just in fragments, but in us.